Broadcasting live from the Business Radio X studios in Atlanta, Georgia, it's time for CEO Exclusive, brought to you by Anona Enterprises.
Good morning and welcome to CEO Exclusive, where we get emerging trends from CEOs and their most trusted advisors. I'm your host, Soyini Koch. Around this time last year, we had an interesting show on business divorces. And I was really surprised to find that show was actually the most shared show that we had in 2017. And so this year, I thought during the kind of dog days of summer, while you guys are off, on vacation, we would actually talk to like a real divorce lawyer. I know that most of you listeners have longstanding happy marriages, but you never know. You might have a friend, a brother, a cousin who you know is thinking about a divorce, and this might actually make a really big difference for them. So I'm really delighted to welcome Alvah Smith. He is a divorce lawyer who specializes in working with high net worth individuals, and he's one of the partners at Levine, Smith, Snider, and Wilson. Welcome to the show,
Thank
Al.
you very much, Sweeney. Glad to be here.
It's really funny because before, while we were getting coffee, Stone, who is the producer and co-owner of Business Radio X, said, "You know what? I can't afford to get a divorce." But I would love for you to just tell us, of your clients, is it less likely that somebody who's a CEO is getting a divorce? Like, how does that look to you? Because at least from my chair, having done 160 interviews, the vast majority of our CEOs are kind of in happy, long-standing marriages.
Well, based on some statistics I've seen, the higher educated, higher income people do tend to get divorced less often than lesser educated people. So I'm sure that's probably true of most of the CEOs that you talk to. However, it does happen, and baby boomers tend to be divorced more often than other generations.
Wow.
And in fact, 50 and up is one of the fastest growing segments of people getting divorced. I was looking at some statistics recently, and they said that it has doubled for age 50 to 65 since 1990, the divorce rate. And for those over 65, it has tripled since 1990. So, a lot of people are getting near, maybe even at retirement age, and then deciding at that point to make a change in their life. But overall, I would say that probably people that you do deal with are probably less likely to be divorced.
I find it shocking, though, that somebody would reach 50, 60, 70 and decide that, they've been married for however long and it's time to get a divorce. You'd think that they'd just kind of hang in there.
You think they would, and some do. And there are probably a lot of people are in very unhappy families and unhappy marriages that are still there. But I think what happens is that children go and they're empty nesters, and they look at each other, and some of them just are not happy with their situation. People are living longer now, obviously, and so they may look at their 60, but they may say, this is 30 more years of my life. Is this where I want to be? And people tend to start making moves at that point. Luckily, more and more women are working outside the home, so they may be in a better financial situation themselves at that point in their lives.
So, Al, what, in your observation, is the difference between, let's say, a CEO getting a divorce, high net worth individual getting a divorce, and maybe other people who find themselves in that situation?
Well, with someone like that, you've got a lot more complications with their financial situation. Obviously, they're probably making more income than the average person. They may have stock options, stock awards, restricted stock units, possibly ownership interest in a closely held corporation. So those tend to complicate matters quite a bit when you're dividing up assets in a divorce case.
So what are the trends or the recommendations that you're seeing that our CEO listeners who are probably in happy marriages, but they may have a brother, a friend, a cousin, or know somebody that they should be thinking about?
Well, I think first off, you want to think about what can you do to keep your marriage happy. I think that's the first start, and try to stay in a relationship. I mean, no one really wants to go through a divorce, generally speaking. It's not a pleasant experience. I've never been through one myself, but I can't imagine being on the other side of this. So the first thing is to work on the marriage and make sure you stay in a good, happy marriage, and you keep the communications open between the two of you, which I think is one of the major starting points of divorce, is communications and lack thereof. which leads to other problems in the marriage. But from otherwise, I don't generally tell people. I'd have people come into me sometimes and say, I'm thinking about getting divorced. What should I do? Should I start transferring assets to my brother? Do I put things in trust? I don't ever advise doing that. A lot of that's going to just come back to haunt you when you go through a divorce if you've tried to do some transfers. So from the standpoint, just live your life and do what you need to do, and don't do anything to try to, we jokingly call it raids when someone gets divorced. It's recently acquired income deficiency syndrome, that all of a sudden their income goes from, in half. I hear that all the time. I'm not making how much I used to make, but those things never work out. So just live your life, and if it happens, it happens.
All right. And so what are some of the trends in the law that you think our CEOs should be aware of?
Well, one of the most important things that we're seeing right now is that a change in the tax law is going to have a tremendous impact on alimony. Currently, the way it's been, I've been doing this for 33 years, and even before then, alimony is tax deductible by the payor and taxable to the payee. And typically, the payor is going to be in a higher tax bracket. So that means he or she will get a bigger tax break than the impact on the recipient of the alimony. Well, under the new tax law that's been passed effective January 1, for any settlement agreements or final judgments and decree of divorce after January 1 or January 1 forward, alimony is no longer going to be tax deductible. So that's going to have a tremendous impact on how much alimony someone pays. You're not going to get that tax benefit. So if you're in a 40% tax bracket, if you're paying $1,000 in alimony after tax, that's really only costing you $600. Now that $1,000 is going to cost you $1,000. So that's going to have a big impact, I think, on how we think about alimony and the amount that people pay. And so that's one thing on the horizon that all of us divorce attorneys are a little concerned about, because we don't know how's that going to look? How that going to affect our clients?
Anything else?
Well, there's always changes. The divorce law in Georgia doesn't change quickly. We don't have a lot of statutes. We're relying upon a lot of case law by the Georgia Supreme Court, and we don't get a whole lot of rulings. So the law doesn't change that much, but of interest is how we deal with what we call separate property. In a divorce case, when you get divorced, we equitably divide the marital assets. Equitable means fair. It doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. It means just fair under all the circumstances of the marriage and the divorce. And the marital assets are those that are acquired by the efforts of the parties during the marriage. So anything you owned prior to the marriage, or anything you inherit during the marriage or receive by gift from a third party is considered your separate property.
So the business before they get married is the CEO's. If they inherit money from their parents, they keep that.
Correct.
And what was the third one?
Third would be like a gift from your parents or something else like that.
You don't have to separate. You don't have to split that.
They don't have an equitable division claim to it. Okay. There's some roundabout ways called lump sum alimony, which is rare. But where it gets complicated is if you have a business, let's say the CEO has onyership interest in a closely held corporation.
They founded a business when they were they're 30 years old.
Had it 10 years before the marriage.
Right.
But then say they're married for 20 years. And so during that 20 years, that business has grown in value. If the growth in that business is due to the CEO's active management and running that business, that appreciation in the business is marital and is subject to the spouse's claims. On the other hand, if it appreciates due to what we call outside market forces, it's not marital asset. The best example of an outside market force, really not so much on a closely held business, but like if you own Coca-Cola stock and it goes up in value, you don't work for Coke, or you own a piece of raw land and it goes up in value because market values go up. Those remain separate assets. But it gets very complicated when you start, having a business grow in value. They have claims against it. You've got to go back. What was it worth 20 years ago when we got married? What is it worth today? And then you get in a lot of issues of valuation. The other thing that would be of interest to a CEO is that when we value a business, there are two different parts to it. There's enterprise goodwill and there's personal goodwill.
Would you explain what those are?
Enterprise goodwill is the value that the business has in and of itself. Personal goodwill is the value that you as the individual bring to that particular business. And it could be maybe as an insurance agency. If it's Johnson Insurance Agency and everybody knows Johnson Insurance Agency, that part of it is probably going to be enterprise goodwill.
Mm-hmm.
But if Mr. Johnson is the guy that goes down the street and knocks on the doors and he's round up the business and he's got this personal relationship with people, that part of the value would be personal goodwill.
So it's kind of, if we were going to use business speak, it's the maybe the business brand versus your personal brand.
That's true.
Okay.
That's true. And so when you get down to value and you have to break out those two parts of the value, because the personal goodwill is not considered a marital asset. So the spouse does not have a claim to that value, whereas the enterprise goodwill has value.
But only during the time of the appreciation during the marriage.
Exactly. It gets very complicated. It's, and we get into a lot of arguments about that, or discussions. And we have competing appraisers. We get business evaluators. We get forensic accountants involved in those kind of cases. And it does get complicated.
Wow. And so how do prenups change all of that?
Prenups can change all of that. A prenuptial agreement can state basically whatever you want it to do. And for the most part, they are upheld in Georgia. So you could put into a prenuptial agreement that anything I earn during the marriage remains my separate property, and the spouse has no claim to it. The spouse could waive their right to alimony. So it doesn't, you can set all the laws aside in a prenup. I do recommend, particularly people who are in a second marriage, or if they have children and they want to make sure they're protected, or if they have fairly significant assets or premarital, business or something, that a prenup, they ought to have one. And to be honest with you, I advise my business owners and the moneyed spouse that you're a fool not to have a prenup, and I advise the other spouse you're a fool to sign the prenup.
Really?
Generally speaking, because most of the time that spouse is giving up a lot of claims that he or she otherwise would have. There's an interesting case from the Supreme Court of Georgia where a man who was worth about $6 million married the hostess at a restaurant in Buckhead. She had little or nothing. They stayed married, and she signed a prenup. And she didn't have a lawyer look at it. She went to a lawyer. He said, "I'm too busy. I don't have time." So she didn't have a lawyer look at it. They were married for 20 plus years. They had 4 children. His net worth went from about $6 million to about $24 million. And the prenup gave her, I think, roughly $2,900 a month for 4 years. That was it. And the Supreme Court upheld that prenuptial agreement. Generally speaking, to uphold the agreement, it can't be entered into any kind of fraud or undue influence, duress, non-disclosure of information. It can't be considered unconscionable. And the facts...
That sounds pretty unconscionable.
I would agree with you on that one. In fact, the first lawyer the husband went to see said, "There's no way this agreement is going to be upheld," but it was. And
that's kind of rough.
That's pretty rough. The third factor is that the facts and circumstances haven't changed to make it no longer fair. In that particular case, the court said, well, you could have anticipated his net worth is going to triple or quadruple in 20 years, and you could anticipate you're going to have 4 children. So, no. I think if they had a chance to look at that case again, it might go otherwise. But right now, that tells you that most any prenup is probably going to be upheld as long as the main thing is the full disclosure of all assets and liabilities and income. That's the biggest thing that can throw one out. But a prenup can work, and it certainly is important for someone who has separate assets. And even if all it says is it sets forth your separate assets, and sometimes I'll have people and they say, look, whatever I earned during the marriage, alimony, all that's still on the table. I just want to make sure that what I own or what I've inherited stays my separate property. And so a lot of times that's all I'm doing in a prenup is clarifying what we have, putting it in paper, signing that I'm not going to make a claim on that premarital business or that inheritance that you're going to receive or have received. And it's almost a restatement of the existing law, but it really helps.
And so why do you say that it's the person who's signing the prenup is a fool?
Because typically that person is going to be the non-moneyed spouse. I mean, usually it's every now and then I'll have people who kind of have similar situations, but usually it's like the hostess at the Atlanta fish market who's making an hourly wage and marrying somebody worth $6 million. And so she's giving up claims that she would have. I mean, she would have probably had a significant claim against that $20+ million. She would have had claim for significantly more alimony than $2,900 for 4 years on a 20-year marriage with that kind of net worth. So that person is giving up a lot, and usually love conquers. And, they'll say, I'll sign anything. I want to marry him. And, hopefully those marriages work out. But if they don't, that person has probably put themselves in a bad situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. Wow. So you said that, of course, you want people to stay married. Communication is the number one thing. What other issues do you see that are bringing people to your office? And what would you recommend for people who want to stay married?
Well, there's no question. I would say probably half the cases I have, adultery has been in play at some point during the marriage, either then or earlier. I do see that a good bit. I would say 50% is a pretty high percentage of that.
That's verified by statistics.
I haven't really looked at any statistics, but that's just my own anecdotal history of my cases alone. There, unfortunately, we also see issues with alcohol and drugs that impact, and that impacts up and down the socioeconomic scale. It's not just the lower income. It's in high asset cases as well, where there is issues of alcoholism or drug abuse. So that can be a problem. It's just a lot of times it's just people grow apart and they have differences. And, it's amazing how two people can be so in love, but then they can be so in hate when they get to a divorce situation. And I see that all the time. You sometimes I think and look at these couples and I go back, there was a wedding day where everybody was so happy and excited. Now look where we are.
Yeah.
And how did they get there? I don't know. But, the keeping the communications open, because I think even issues like adultery and sometimes even, issues with addiction can be the result of this failure to communicate and failure to keep in a close relationship. Have that time together. I think we get so busy, and I'm sure CEOs work long hours. They're busy at work, and sometimes we ignore what's back home. And I work long hours as well, but you've got to make those times when you can spend some time with your wife, your husband, and, and the same with the children. You need, I think that spouses need some alone time with each other. It's not really alone, but together without the kids. Have that date night, have that time together. I think those things are very important to try to keep your relationship alive and keep your marriage together. Because the last thing any CEO wants to do, it's time consuming, it's emotionally draining. Mm-hmm. To go through a divorce. I always remember years ago, I represented a heart surgeon and we were having a trial. And, I'm thinking, what he goes through as a heart surgeon. And we were about the third day of this jury trial. He looks at me and says, I don't see how you do this. This is just so stressful. And so I'm thinking, you're a heart surgeon. What you do is so stressful. Can you imagine? But that's puts it in perspective, I think, of how much this takes of people's lives when they go through this. So it's not a pleasant experience.
Right. And then the flip side is, as you said, it's very emotional. So somebody listening to this, even if it's just one person who listens to this show, they're really emotional. They're upset. They're thinking about going through a divorce. What are your recommendations for what they need to do? The first 3-4 things that they need to do. I'm not happy. I'm thinking about going through a divorce. What do I need to do?
I think the first thing I would tell anybody, particularly if they're very emotional about it, get some counseling. Your lawyer, we're not trained to be counselors and therapists. We do a lot of it just because it happens. But I would highly recommend find a good therapist.
This is not marriage counseling.
This is not necessarily marriage counseling. Okay. This is individual counseling.
Okay.
I mean, let's assume they've gone through marriage counseling or it didn't work or they're beyond that. But get your own personal counselor. Help yourself to begin with from that standpoint, and then see a lawyer.
I'm shocked that that's your first recommendation.
Well, I really do think that. I think you've got to get your head straight. And I think that will help you because, like I say, your divorce lawyer is not trained to give you that kind of advice. So you need to get, yourself in the right place mentally, emotionally, as much as you can before you proceed. I mean, there's some situations, if there's abuse going on or something like that, you may just have to get out. But if it's a situation where you've been in it and you're just not happy, find that first. And then, meet with a lawyer. Go kick some tires. You want to you want to kind of understand what are my rights, what's potentially can happen here. No one can tell you exactly what's going to happen, but I can meet with somebody in an hour. And if they've got sort of their marital balance sheet. I know what their assets and liabilities and the income and a little bit of the expenses. I can give them, a general range of what they're looking at ultimately in a division of property and alimony, child support, and such as that. So it's good to go at least talk to, one or two lawyers and understand that. Find a lawyer if you're going forward that you're comfortable with. That's important. You want to make sure you have a good rapport with that person. I would think, I've never been on the other side of it, but if I went around and met with, 2 or 3 lawyers, you're going to find a comfort level where you feel like they're listening to you, or you feel like you can talk to them and they're giving you good answers. I think that's important. So find that first before you go forward. But, from a CEO standpoint, again, would I start transferring assets around? I don't. There are some laws about that, and if you do some transfers, it could come back that it's considered fraudulent if you do it in anticipation of divorce. So I don't ordinarily start doing that kind of thing.
What can someone do though if they have a business and they're trying to, for lack of a better word, protect their business in a divorce?
Well, I mean, there are, sometimes you can put assets in trust. That's not my area of expertise, but there are certain things that could potentially be done in trust, but I don't ordinarily go that route. So really the best you can do, is just run your business. I mean, to me, that's, I always tell people, don't run your life. Don't let the divorce run your life. Run your life. Don't sit here and cut back on how much you're working or how much you're making just so you can cut down on your alimony award or something. Look at, because ultimately that's going to hurt you down the road if you're cutting back on your income or something. So I typically tell people, run your life, run your business just like you always have. And it'll all fall into place.
So, as you think about, the pros and cons of getting a divorce, how much of it actually just does come down to money? Like how many people, if it were not a financial concern, would probably go ahead with the divorce? And how much are you just literally dealing with the dollars and cents of the marriage?
Well, if there's not a custody battle, let's take children out of the picture. If we're not dealing with children, it comes down to a business deal.
Wow.
But it's an emotional business deal. But really it's money. And that's what we fight about. Once we get past the emotions, and if we don't have to deal with custody and children, then it's a money deal. And it's how much am I going to get and how much have I got to pay? And that's what it comes down to be completely frank. And a lot of times when I represent business owners and CEOs, a lot of them look at it that way. This is a business deal. And a lot of them may pay a premium, a little bit more than maybe if they had went to court, but it's sort of like that's a price of doing business. I'm going to pay this premium. I'm going to get on with my life. I'm going to put this behind me. But for the spouse, let's say you have a stay-at-home mom who hasn't worked in 25 years, they're scared to death because this may be all they're going to get for the rest of their lives. They might be able to go out and be a receptionist or something, but a lot of the housewives and mothers don't have, obviously, the earning capacity that the CEO does. And so they're scared to death. So they're trying to get as much as they can to protect themselves down the road. But that's, kind of how I look at it. But it does come down to money for the most part.
So this is the cynic, right? This is, listeners, this is probably why I'm 42 years old and not married, to be honest. How much of it is a business deal in the beginning?
You mean in the marriage? That's an interesting question. Maybe that's for the therapist. I don't think people go into marriages looking at it as a business deal unless it's somebody who has significant assets and they do a prenuptial agreement, which of course starts off the marriage as a business relationship, which that's, tricky to start with. But I would say for the average, see so many people, if they get married in their 20s, they may or may not have that much financially, and they're not looking at it like that. So if you have a 25, 30-year marriage where all this has been accumulated during the marriage, I don't think people go into it looking at it as a business deal. But on the other hand, money issues and financial issues are a significant problem in marriages. Even with people who make a lot of money, there can be issues with money and spending and who spends how much and those kind of things that, it can have an impact. So again, that goes back to that communication. talking about it, being open with each other about spending and how we're going to spend, budgeting. And it doesn't matter how much. I mean, I've had people with huge budgets. They make a lot of money, but they spend a lot of money. And so, even those people need to have some understanding of the finances of their marriage, going into it early on and keeping those lines of communication open as well.
Great. Well, wow. This has been a really, really interesting show, Al. It's been great having you. And I'm wondering if you have any parting advice or, tell us about your practice. What's new and exciting happening in your practice?
Well, we have a firm of 10 lawyers, which is a fairly good size for divorce firms in Atlanta. There's only maybe 3 or 4 that are larger than ours. And so this is all we do. I've been doing it myself for 33 years of family law. Fell into it. It wasn't what I was looking to do. I was trying to get into litigation practice and interview with a firm that did primarily divorce. So I took the job, and 33 years later, here I am. But as you said, we handle, generally speaking, high asset, high income cases, complex matters. And that's kind of what we do.
All right. Well, thank you. Listeners, we've been talking to Al Smith, a divorce lawyer from Levine, Smith, Snider, and Wilson here in Atlanta. And you've been listening to CEO Exclusive. I'm your host, Soyini Koch. I hope you have a profitable, prosperous, and very productive week. Thanks.
Thank you.
This show is brought to you by Anona Enterprises, where strategy is your access to money and performance. Learn more at AnonaEnterprises.com.